very basic and simple tool that we often take for granted because we use these things or some variant thereof in our life, daily life, from everything from signing our name to something to cashing a check to doodling when we're on the phone or ignoring somebody yelling in the background, right? Sometimes we fumble them, we twirl them, we wave them around, we use them as pointers, and we emphasize, we scratch. Hey, clear our ears with it, right? Scratch your back. I don't know. Better not be sticking your nose with this thing. Anyway, the mighty pen, all right? The pen. I'm going to give you a little litany. I don't remember if I read this in a how-to book on the subject of writing well, or it's something I come up with my own, right? Today, 1,000,000 people are going to go out there and they're going to tell somebody, I'm going to write a book. Of that 1,000,000 people, 100,000 people are actually going to sit down, pick up this thing here or some variant thereof, their laptop, what have you, and start putting thoughts to paper. They're going to conceive a blueprint or some backstory or some character development, what have you, but they're going to begin that journey. Of the 100,000, 10,000 people will continue to chew through this. They will spend a day, they will spend an hour, they will spend 10 minutes a day, they will spend whatever it takes, however long it takes, to hack their way through a crude, rough draft of the thing that they wish everybody to believe is a story or a novel. It very well may be. It might be the next greatest J.K. Rowling or Stephen King. I mean, 1,000,000 in a million. That happens. But only 100,000 people are actually going to chew their way through that. 10,000 people will pick up that stack of paperwork and scribbled notes and post-it notes and hand towels and encrypted files on their laptop or whatever and go back and rewrite the whole thing. They're going to go through and they're going to smooth it out. They're going to polish. They're going to put their little charts up and their outlines if they're into that sort of thing, and make sure that the continuity that A leads to B, that B goes off to C, but it doesn't disappear off into some tangent, but it comes back, loops back into the storyline, where they're going to pull in the loose ends. They're going to trim off the fat, the things that don't make any sense. Make sure that there is a story and it doesn't get butchered. That's called the rewriting process. Might be able to do it in one shot, might do it in 20. If you're, Mr. Kuntz, I love digging on Mr. Kuntz because his own words. I read the man's book on how to write novels, and he has a great style and formula for a man who's got money. If you got the money, you can afford to do this, or if you got the means. In his case, he doesn't believe in a rewrite. He doesn't believe in any of that stuff. He writes down, this is the story, here's the line out, and then he hands it off to basically an employee, a flunky, who then goes back and does all that work for him and polishes a ghostwriter, if you will, and fills up the things. That's the reason why Mr. Kuntz can crank out 3 to 5 books a year. And if you've read one of Kuntz's books, you've read most of them. Now there's a McDonald's philosophy to a lot of writing out there, and I'll grant you that. This is our formula. This is our our plan, our plot, and the only thing that diverges from it is the scenario, the scene, the setting, and maybe the name of the characters in it. But so then we bring us to 1,000. 1,000 people will take this repackaged book and begin the hard search to find somebody to publish it. They will either self-publish using money out of their own pocket and hope that it can take off and it gets some popularity enough to justify the expense and the hassle and the time, or they will begin the long, arduous process of getting rejection letter after rejection letter from would-be publishers. Now, if you do your homework, you're going to look for the agents and the editors of publishing houses who are interested in the material that you've written. If you have no idea what genre you've wrote or what your stuff fits into, or if it's so elastic that it fits into multiple categories but none into any particular one well, you're going to find it a bit more challenging to try to nail down a publisher. I'm not saying it's impossible. It just says it's going to take time. There's a famous author, and I think I know who his name is, but I'm not going to name it because I don't want to show just how ignorant of a butthead I am sometimes when it comes to memories. But I know that this feller said that if we have the opportunity to get rejections, then we're on the path of success. So we've got to the point where we actually have something to sell to somebody. It's not just some idea in our head, but it's actually an established stack of something or a file of something that we got to sell to somebody. He also got rejected 99 times. 99 times for his first popular novel. He actually had written 3 or 4 novels that didn't do well. They didn't sell well, and that hurt because he had harder and harder time to find somebody who would publish his stuff. He just didn't, from an economic standpoint, he was a dead horse. Then he stumbled onto something that was a brilliant, if not stupid story, and it caught on and it got a movie deal. And next thing you know, he's a millionaire, and all this original stuff was reintroduced and all become bestsellers at one point because of his third, fourth try. But it was that 100th acceptance that got him paid, right? And ask yourself how many years it took for him to get to that point. Perseverance, kept at it. So there's your 1,000. Out of the 1,000, like this feller's story, a few hundred, maybe 100 people out of that 1,000 will become established authors. They will publish a book that will actually hit the mainstream shelves, that will sell, but it's not going to sell, a million copies. He's not going to be a millionaire. And if you've done your homework when it comes to anything but self-publication, if you go through a traditional publishing house, your percentage for what you get out of a book deal is retardedly low. The books, old Kuntz out there is cranking out the books by the score for a reason, in part because he wants money. And if his one book's only going to net him, 20 cents out of a dollar, well, a $20 book, he might get $2. You're going to buy his hardback and it's $29.95. He's going to get maybe $250 out of it, $270 out of it. That's where the volume thing comes in. So if you get 100,000 of these things sold, now he's made $30,000 before taxes. He can actually say he's got a career because he can sustain himself off that. Most writers don't. That's something they don't tell you. The majority of the writers out there, most of the books that we enjoy, those people are not sustaining themselves. They're holding down another job doing something else. It is what it is. So we get ourselves to the 10 out of a million. The 10th person out of a million will actually get a bestseller and will make a decent money out of it. One person out of a million, and that's a long shot even then, will be the next Stephen King or the next J.K. Rowling. They will have a hit that's so popular, so powerful, that every book that they publish thereafter, no matter how trivial or stressful it is or how bland it is going to make money because they've got a name. They won the lottery. So, and Mr. Sam Wise, 7, Tim, you're a great guy. I do like you. Like I said, I like to consider you a friend of sorts, more than an associate, but we're in that associate stage. We're learning, right? So, write the book. A friend, keep writing and penning and struggling, working for that 10% category. Meanwhile, this is what a rough draft can look like. Some of y'all will have it on your little thumb drive and things. I didn't have access to laptops or computers. Well, I did, but I couldn't save nothing. I didn't have the ability to. I didn't have a medium to save on. That wasn't allowed, and so I couldn't put it on the disk and done this electronically. It would have sped things up considerably. I've been procrastinating something terrible the past year, trying to get my game book system digitized while I'm waiting for Golden Games, who I signed a contract with, to produce, to get it into the queue. And they said 16 months to 2 years, and we're not even into the first year yet. But this is manuscript number 2, right? Just show you. My handwritten, often modified story published and printed and written on the back of everything and anything I got my hands on. I actually learned to prefer non-lined blank paper, in part because my handwriting is horrid. It's terrible. I mean, very few people have handwriting worse than me that aren't a doctor. I'm sorry, it's the truth, because I spent so much of my life using word processors and typewriters and laptops, and so are computers, and now a laptop. You know, it just, my penmanship in high school and in elementary school was bad then, and it never improved because I never used it. I used the digital means, but I could get a lot more on a single blank page than I can a line page, because I write small, which irritates some people who have to read my handwriting, because first off, they have to struggle with what does this mean, and even I occasionally have to go back and scratch my head and read the entire premise and go, what the heck does that mean, right? What is he saying? What is he saying? So now, talk about a different element of this stuff, right? Here's some of my notations and what have yous and so forth. I actually had times where I could afford to print and type. I've tried to use some programs that let you translate these over into digital, except they work and they don't. I'm struggling with that with my game system, translating my game books over into a digital format, because it misreads things or it corrupts things, and you have to literally go back line by line and make sure it says what it's supposed to say, and it hasn't changed a word or changed the meaning of a word or the grammar or something in that, and to the point where you just can't read it and you haven't a clue what is going on in here. Like I said, you know, I've got my notations, maps, character bios and development stuff, you know, more map there, character bios and development stuff here, storyline and outlines, what have you, all for this particular book. You keep all that material, try to keep it together. This is what I'm looking for. The last page. 1,269 pages of handwritten material. 1,269. Now I figured, and this is actually partially rewritten. It's a rough draft, but it was rewritten as I went along. My next rough draft will be when I translate that over to a digital format, because the odds are I'm going to have to literally type it all over again. And 1,269 pages. Somebody go, well, that's a huge book, man. No, because I sat down and I did my math, I did my due diligence numerous times, and I know that once you type into the size and font, print font size that's used by most publishing agencies for books these days, I will get roughly 2.5 to 3 pages of my handwritten material into one printed page. The average printed page in a novel, you pick up, hey, one of my favorites, you know, Battletech, got lots of these things. But if you look at them, it's just that I happen to have one laying over here, right? We'll look at the back of this, and what is it? 278 pages. Okay, so 278 pages. If you count the word count across and the lines down, the average is 10 across, 30 to 35 down. So you're going to have an average of 325 to 350 words per page, average. Not an exact count, but that's average. So if you wrote about 1,200 page handwritten material stuff, and it translates down at a roughly 2 to 1, I got about a 350 page book here. Right, and that's providing some of it doesn't end up being chopped up and cut out by me when I go back and do my third rough draft of it, my third to my digital size of it, right? And then of course you got to deal with the editors at the people who produce it. Unless you produce it yourself, which is another animal altogether. You could spend a lot of time on just that, and I'm not going to do it. Not here, not in this particular video. So then Comes number 3. Look at that. Number 3. Right? Isn't that right, kitty? Isn't that right, kitty? All right. Number 3. So here we are. Let me see this. Look at it. Look at the fat man's table, right? Pinning my laptop down and ticking the kitty off. Look at this. Right? Okay. 1, 2, 3. 3. 5 years. 5 years worth of work. Now, in fairness, these 3 books, I was also working 6 to 8 hours a day working on my game. So between the game and this, I consumed probably 10 hours a day average, and that's including notations and backstory workings and character development and histories and so on and so forth, which I have boxes of this stuff. When we moved, our family had to move out of my mom's house. I moved my stuff into storage, and I got at least 15 or 20 boxes. A couple of my earliest vlogs show some of that when it was in the house, in the garage, and all stacked up on shelves in the garage. Well, now it's in a storage shed in the back corner. But all that is proof positive that I did all this from scratch, and I didn't ad-lib. I didn't plagiarize. I didn't steal somebody else's game mechanics system. I created my own system from scratch based off all the knowledge I used. And that's another key tool for writing if you're going to write, and I don't care what you write, is to write and I've read a half dozen books on the subject of how to, what to write, how to write. You know, a lot of these books are from well-established authors, and some are from people who are brainiac university people who never got a book published in their life, except this book, you know, how to write books. Go figure. Anyway, they all agree on a couple subjects. A, if you're going to write every day. I don't care what it is, write every day. Be creative. Keep the craft going. Don't, if you get sidelined, if you get writer's block, set it aside and work on a second project. Get a third project. You know, the creating stuff for a game campaign is an excellent way to keep the writing juices rolling. It is what it is. It helps feed each other. Second, number 2, not only do you need to write every day, write what you know. Now, there's a lot of people that make arguments, oh, I can write anything I want. Okay, sure. I could write a whodunit mystery, but you know what? I don't like whodunit mysteries. I never cared for them that much. I don't watch them on television if I can help it. I don't ever read the books in them. So for me to write a book in that particular genre would be foolhardy at best. I might get dumb lucky and stumble onto the what other people consider a genius literary thing, but it was not because I had any business in that genre. You know, so write every day. Write what you know. 3. 3 is the hard one. Be willing to butcher your baby. Be willing to take a year or 2 years worth of hard work and chuck it. Or completely dismantle it, tear it down, rewrite it, what have you. Now we're running into almost 20 minutes again, right? I've waved these around a couple times, and I can't help it because to me, it's a thing, a passion, what have you. I'm in the middle of digitally trying to rewrite this thing, so I got a digital version of it. But this is my bound copy version of my Stellar Frontier core book. Keeping in mind, Stellar Frontiers is a working title. Yeah, I get it. There's a couple other game systems out there, Starfinders, StarCraft, and a number of others that are quite similar to this in title, but not in how it works. This is a game system exclusively for solo play. It's not an RPG. It's not a tabletop war game, but it's a collaboration of all that. But it's set up in using a formula that Rollmaster established. It was fairly well, using lots of charts in the D100 system. So you can interact with NPCs and negotiate with them and get reasonable good results. You can have combats on the table that you roll out, and your foes will do this, that, and the other thing based on these random charts, and it's reasonable. Then the main core development is Command and Conquer versus SimCities, if you will. You set out to establish your own house in a big, vast universe full of people, and you have a colonial ship and a couple mining ships and a couple scout ships. So basically, you're going to, from the scratch up, build yourself a small empire. And you explore, you settle new colonies. Some of them come to you. You have encounters with pirates and bad guys and other players if you want them involved in your game. It's all in here. It's all playable, all doable, right? This book is almost 320 pages. I have 4 boxes the size of this stack of handwritten variants and type version variants of these things. I have the original premise book, which was this thick. And then I came out 3 or 4 years later, and I had 2 books because we couldn't staple them. We ran into a limit to how thick we could staple something. So it had to be 2 parts to 1 book. That 2-part book became this book. And I got 2 more up here, one for blueprints and the other one for equipment guide. So 10 years, friends. Damn near 10 years, and I'm still working on it. Still working on it. Even though I got a game contract. I got a contract. I can print it out and wave it at you, digitally show it to you, but I think I'm not going to, I don't want to hork off anybody. That's why I'm not ranting and raving about, why it seems like it's taken forever. Then, in addition to these 3, these 3 are important because, and that's why they're in here with me, because these 3 actually are based off of my game system, or set in the world that my game system created. And a friend and I collaborated on this when this was our game campaign. This is our game campaign. Him and I co-wrote. Basically, we sat down or traded notes back and forth, and I would set up the scenario. Here's the adventure. This is what you're going to do. What has to happen. What your characters say. And he would take on the roles of this character or that character depending on the scene or the chapter. Now, I'm a huge fan of convoluted wheels within wheels sort of stories. And so I liked having multiple characters. I liked having multiple storylines going that were all intertwined. I started all this before I ever set foot or lifted a page of Game of Thrones. And when I looked at Game of Thrones, I thought, there's a lot of similarities between this and that. This is set in space and 5,000, 8,000 years in humanity's future, and there's no different than 100 other style books of the type, except there's a huge in-depth investment to it. Do other books, other things that we read and we become interested in affect our style of writing? Yeah, it does. And any writer that tells you it does is lying to you or is deluding themselves. But in the basic gist of this thing, him and I, my friend and I, had played on the early days of the creation for Stellar Frontiers. We played several campaigns, and we developed his house. Then I was forced to move, and it was a 3 or 4 year window there that I wasn't able to stay in contact with him. And it was at that point that I had access to the computer and a printer, and I typed all this up and printed out this bound up book. Not this stuff, of course, but this stuff. But in that 4 years, because I couldn't play the game with him, I wanted to know what was going to happen to the characters in his campaign, what was going to go forward. And I thought, okay, well, I don't want to preempt him, because if we got back together again, we could restart the game, blah, blah, blah. So I thought, well, what would it be like in 20 years? What would be the next stage? And it was his prime character, his house lord, was in the process of getting married in the game, if you will. What if he finally established his dynasty and he had a bunch of kids and they were hitting that 18 to 22 stage? And what would they do in the world? And that's where the books started to get started. And I picked one of the characters that was vaguely mentioned name that could have been potentially used for an offspring of the original character and his new spouse, and said, well, what if he's 18, 19 years old and he's at the beginning of his own hero's journey? And this bloomed into these three things right here, and I got partial 4. And there's enough material and backstory in this story to actually have a series of about eight novels. We've been life has really thrown a wrench into my think right now. It's been we're in a survival mode setting at the moment. We're fighting to just get through the day and the week and the next week, and then and for some of us, we have to have a little bit of mental space to, in some cases, physical space to really get the creative juices focused to flow. It's hard to sit here when you have somebody 2 feet away from you who's got their own wants and cares and needs to be addressed, and try to write something where you really have to get yourself into a mindset, and then have somebody go, you just, it's almost impossible for it to be achieved. The argument on that aspect, though, is that this stuff here is pre-written, so it just needs polish. So I can work on that, which is why I'm working on digitizing the core book. But it's such a task because the programs don't translate well, especially when you're dealing with lots of charts and numbers and stats and things like that. And they all have to be in a specific place, and it has to line up, and they all have to read right. And when it wants to change O's to zeros and zeros to O's, and this line to that thing, and things that I don't even know what that thing is, and because it's translating it wrong, you have to physically look at everything and make sure it's all there. And then I'm going to have to go back and redo it again to polish the polish, if you will. So, like I said, this is just 3 in the story, and it grew. We started with one character, and then I thought, well, I don't like this sole focus as a writer. I don't like writing from the first perspective. I did this, I did that. I'm not writing about me for me. I don't even like reading books like that, because it makes me focus on what I'm thinking. And my character, if I'm reading a book character and I'm reading it from a first person perspective, I start arguing with myself saying, well, I wouldn't say that, or I wouldn't do that, or why the heck would I do something like that? No, so I always go with a narrative third person view. And so in the aspect, we take on the role of the character in the story, even if it's just briefly. And then when I also don't like a book that totally solely focuses on one individual, because it gets old fast, in my opinion. Especially in the short attention span mindset of the world today, much better to have, say, 5 or 6 really colorful characters and a bunch of NPCs, and as long as they all have, I don't know, 2-3 pages worth of material and dialogue, and then move on to the next one. So we have an average of 3 encounters per chapter, if you will, or 3 encounters per adventure, if you want to look at it at that aspect. And then over the course of the campaign, it's 30 to 40 chapters, or 30 to 40 adventures, and they all intertwine to some degree and play off each other to some degree. They're influenced by other things. This is where we end up with one of these things. And one day I sat down and I looked at this huge pile, and oh my God, I've got a novel over here. And actually I had to go to the point where I said, hey, we got to stop, because this is getting too crazy. It's getting too big. And I had to go back about 8 or 9 chapters, and I found a spot where it was a natural cliffhanger and a great place to end book 1. And I had to rewrite all of those 8 to 10 chapters to make them the beginning of book 2. Now, creating a book 1 is very difficult, because you need a beginning, a middle, and an end, a definite end. The book needs to, even with a cliffhanger, it needs to be satisfactory as a standalone book. That way, if somebody ever reads it, they go, I like this. I'd like to read more about the guy or the series, or is there more about this? And then they go look for book 2. Unless you initially state that when you're coming out at the very beginning, this is going to be book 1 of a set or a series or whatever, a trio. So that's how George Lucas created Star Wars, the original movie and novel. Yeah, he had it in mind that he'd like to do more movies, but he couldn't be 100% sure it was going to. So Star Wars: A New Hope basically was a beginning, a middle, and an end. That we did not have to go on to the book, movie 2 and movie 3 and book blah 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 blah. And now look at it now, right? But he didn't plan it. He had to. He did, but he didn't. He had to assume it would be a one-shot wonder, and he was successful. So book 2, at the end of book 2 in here, we have an obvious segue to book 3, because there's so much of the story left to be told, and we have things that were concluded and drawn, that conclusions were made, and scenario, bad guys were ended, some good guys were ended, some things changed, and then we get into new things that are the domino effect of the old things. And so we have to know in ourselves as the writers, what the heck come next. I wrote it for myself. And if you and Joe Q Public read it and go, I like this, win-win for all of us. But at the beginning, I wrote for myself. The same thing happened with this. I wanted to play. I wanted to game. I didn't have the books. I didn't have rules. I couldn't get access to the stuff that I had at home. D&D stuff was expensive and problematic. So I said, you know what, I'm going to just make something for myself. And I started scribbling little notes down and started playing this thing by myself, and it built, and somebody said, hey, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm doing this. And he said, I'd like to get on that. And then a lot of those earliest things were up here in my head. So he'd come to me, and then other people got involved, and they said, hey, how do I do this? What do I do? How does this isn't working. What do we do? And I'd run back to my room, and I'd cram and I'd hammer, and I'd talk to him, and I'd work it out. Next thing I know, okay, here's what we do, and then I wrote it down, and then I typed it up, and then somebody else would come along and say, I don't quite get this, or this doesn't quite, and we kept working at it, and I did all the work. They just asked the questions, which they motivated me to do the things I would have otherwise not done. And then I reached a point where I said, I need to write all this down, because how is it that if somebody who wanted to play this game picked up the book, the rules book as I had it, 2/3 of what was in there or needed to be in there was still in my head or in my notes, and I need to have this all concise and in an order that can be easily referenced and utilized. And it took several years of rewriting and working through that, and all through that time we were still developing more stuff and adding more things to it. The rules grew, because the original concept, the end result is much different from the original concept. It was a much simpler game back then, and so I still had the mechanics set up for that way, and if plausible, later could reintroduce this game system in a simpler form for that much lesser, narrower play. But meanwhile, before I even got to that point, we go back even further. I found myself with a lot of time on my hands, and I needed to do something constructive. And an associate of mine at the time said, write a book. And I looked at him like he was a lunatic. Are you out of your loving mind? My handwriting's horrible, and blah, blah, blah. And he says, no, but you tell so many good stories, and as a game master, you're gaming, it's enjoyable, and you've got something to say it, get it out there, make something. And I sat down, and it took me 2 years to do my first novel, manuscript, if you will. And it's sitting in a series of folders in a box in the storage shed. And then there was 2 or 3 others. I wrote a sword and sorcery version, because most of my stuff is sci-fi, and it's 80% complete. And then I got sidebarred on this project here, so I put it in a box so it can be rewritten and completed. Then there's 2. I took a stab at writing my own Star Trek novel from a more militaristic mindset than kind of all a mirror darkly stuff, but without the extreme ultimate universe. It was the modern universe, but I was always of the opinion, and still have been, that the Federation's primary mindset when it comes to military versus exploration is considerably flawed. And their history over and over and over again proves that there are a lot of hostile races out there that they encounter that don't think in that aspect of the way the Federation does. And you need to have a well-established defensive ability to protect your interests, and you're a fool not to. And their stopgap of having the Starfleet be a peaceful exploration force that can defend the Federation when necessary don't fly. I'm sorry, it don't fly. And so we see that in some of the later movies and the series when we start dealing with the Dominion and the Klingons for real, especially with the Dominion and the Borg, where they were forced to create ships that were truly defense or offensive weapons first. The Defiant's a classic example of that. That is a fighting warship from the frame up, designed to fight the Borg. And what does it do? It once they got the quirks worked out of it, it is a firecracker in a small package and impresses the bejesus out of just about everything that comes across it. So can you imagine something on the scale of a Galaxy class warship? I'm just saying, right? So as a story perspective, that's what I tried to do. Now we're running into a half hour. This is just one of those that's just going to run on. What can you do? So I have 5 completed manuscripts. I have 1 almost completed and 2 50% completed, right? And that's not including the 3 books for my would-be Star Frontiers game system. So, Tim, write on, work on, publish, get published, do your thing. You know, fill your satchel up here, fill your tote, get them creative juices going. Write what you love. Write for yourself. Write for yourself first. Don't worry about the other guy. They're going to love it. Or they're going to hate it. Doesn't matter. At the end of the day. Talk to me. Talk to me about this thing. Is this an obsession? Is this a hobby? Hear the thump. Feel the words of the power. Hundreds of these things later.